George's voice became deeper. He repeated his words rhythmically as though he had said them many times before. Guys like us that work on ranches are the loneliest guys in the world. They got no family. They don't belong no place. They come to a ranch and work up a stake, and then they go into town and blow their stake, and the first thing you know, they're pounding their tail on some other ranch. They ain't got nothing to look ahead to. Lenny was delighted. That's it, that's it. Now tell how it is with us. George went on. With us, it ain't like that. We got a future. We got somebody to talk to that gives a damn about us. We don't have to sit in no barroom blowing in our jack just because we got no place else to go. If them other guys gets in jail, they can rot for all anybody gives a damn, but not us. Lenny broke in. But not us. And why? Because I got you to look after me, and you got me to look after you, and that's why. I'm Nick Reveles, and this is OperaTalk. My subject today is Carlisle Floyd's opera of Mice and Men, based on the John Steinbeck novella of 1937. The opera premiered in Seattle in 1970. Now, some of you in the audience may think that 1970 was a long time ago, but actually in opera years, that's just like yesterday. Of Mice and Men is rather like a contemporary or a modern opera. Now, just because I used those two words doesn't mean that you run screaming from the room or take the next 25 minutes to raid the refrigerator. Stick with me. This is a terrific piece. There's some gorgeous music in it. And you'll find, I think, that the composer uses many of the same musical techniques that his forebears used in terms of characterization and text painting. But first, a little bit about the story. John Steinbeck set this story in the late 1920s in the Salinas Valley near the town of Soledad. Into this rural setting come George Milton and Lenny Small, two men, bindlestiffs as they're called, traveling from ranch to ranch looking for work. George is the smarter of the two. He's the natural leader. He's small, and as Steinbeck describes him, he's got angular features, he's very bright, he's spent most of his time in the fields. Lenny is larger, a cumbersome man, taller, and he has the mental capacity of a child. He loves to pet small animals, field mice, rabbits, small puppies. He loves the way they feel, how soft and furry. The problem is, like any child, he sometimes is a little too hard on these animals, and he unintentionally harms them or kills them. At the beginning of the story, George and Lenny are on the run because Lenny got a little too close to a woman. He was attracted by her dress. He loved the color, the look, the silky softness of the dress, and he held it and wouldn't let go. She thought that he was going to attack her. She cried out. George and Lenny ran away, and they're running from the police, from vigilantes, looking for a new place to work. They find that place to work, and there a ranch foreman by the name of Curly has a beautiful young new wife. At one point, at the climax of the story, she gives Lenny her hair, long, soft, blonde, and beautiful, to stroke and pet. We know tragedy will ensue as Lenny refuses to let go. Tell you what I'll do, Lenny. First chance I get, I'll give you a pup. Maybe you wouldn't kill it. That'd be better than mice. And you could pet it harder. Lenny avoided the bait. He had sensed his advantage. If you don't want me, you only just got to say so, and I'll go off in those hills right there, right up in those hills, and live by myself. And I won't get no mice stole from me. George said, I want you to stay with me, Lenny. Somebody'd shoot you for a coyote if you was by yourself. No, you stay with me. John Steinbeck was the quintessential California artist. having been born and raised in Salinas and having set most of his fictional works in that agricultural milieu that he knew so well. From very early in his life, his great desire was to become a writer, and his early work experiences in Salinas, Monterey, San Francisco, and the fields of Central California informed his later writing with a sense of rugged authenticity. Like many of his works, Of Mice and Men takes place in and around the area where he grew up, the heart of the vital California agricultural industry. The workforce for the great California farms in the late 19th century was made up mostly of what were called bindlestiffs, men who traveled from one farm to another with their bedrolls or bindles on their backs. Although Of Mice and Men was written in 1937, it was set in the late 20s prior to the massive influx of starving Okies in the 30s seeking refuge from the devastating effects of their Dust Bowl existence back home. Steinbeck cared deeply for all these workers, and his growing fame helped focus the nation on the plight of these underpaid, ill-treated workers. Steinbeck originally entitled this story Something That Happened, and that's essentially what he accomplishes in this 70-page tragedy. He just lays the story out. There's no moralizing, there's no editorializing. We don't know why these two men's dreams of home and property are crushed so cruelly. Steinbeck doesn't tell us why the thread of violence runs so close to the surface of the fabric of these ranch hands' existence. But that's what makes the story all the more tragic. George and Lenny are dreamers, and they're in a situation that chews dreamers up and spits them out. There's no way out for George and Lenny, and that's what makes this such a tragedy. Steinbeck considered Of Mice and Men something of an experiment, rather like a novelized play. In fact, it lays out in very short, discrete scenes with lots of dialogue and very little narrative or descriptive writing. George S. Kaufman, the famous Broadway producer and director, thought that the book would make a terrific play, and so he approached Steinbeck about scripting such a piece. The play opened in 1937 on Broadway, and it played for 200 performances, which is rather remarkable for a straight play with no music. Of Mice and Men was also filmed by Hollywood, starring Lon Chaney Jr. as Lenny and Burgess Meredith as George. With all of these dramatic elements involved, Carlisle Floyd, the American composer, found this story ripe for operatic treatment. Carlisle Floyd is one of America's most respected and popular opera composers today. As a matter of fact, he's composed 10 operas, among them Susanna and The Passion of Jonathan Wade. Both of these operas are pieces that we've produced here at San Diego Opera. Susanna is a retelling of the biblical story of Susanna and the elders. Many artists and sculptors particularly have dealt with this subject over the years. Carlisle Floyd updates the piece to the Appalachians in America and gives it a kind of folk flavor and yet at the same time a little bit of his inimitable dissonance. The Passion of Jonathan Wade is an epic work, an operatic treatment of a Union officer's moral dilemma in approaching the reconstructed South. This piece has sweep and romance and grandeur. It's really one of the great operas and deserves a more prominent place on opera stages today. Of Mice and Men is, as far as I'm concerned, another masterwork. I love this piece because it does very many of the same things that older composers like Mozart, Bizet, Wagner, Puccini, and certainly Verdi did in their own operas. You probably remember in our conversation about Verdi's Falstaff that Verdi uses certain melodic and rhythmic devices underneath the text that the singers are singing in order to propel the story, in order to underline the text or to paint it, as it were. Carlisle Floyd does the very same thing. As a matter of fact, here's a perfect example. This is in Lenny's aria. George discovers that Lenny has a dead mouse in his pocket, and George says, "What do you want with a dead mouse?" Lenny responds, It was something I could stroke, something I could pet, and it belonged to me. It was something small, not growed up yet, something soft with fur, and I could stroke and pet it like I loved to do. In the woodwind section of the orchestra, Mr. Floyd uses a wonderful rhythmic device that, to my ear, to my imagination, seems like the petting of a small animal. See if it strikes your imagination in the same way. Interestingly, this idea recurs at certain important points of the story, particularly during the final meeting between Curly's wife and Lenny, when she offers her beautiful long blonde hair for him to stroke and to pet. There's another wonderful moment in this opera, and it concerns, actually, Curly's wife. She's a very interesting character. As I say, her role has been somewhat expanded from the book, and she's something of a tease. She comes into the bunkhouse with the ranch hands, and she's very sexy, she's very beautiful, and she, either wittingly or unwittingly, teases these men. Well, there's a figure in her vocal line, which, again, to my ear, is a kind of characteristic of teasing. Many, many notes grouped over one beat of music. Let me show you what I mean. Can you imagine being a soprano and having to sing a line like that? The same idea becomes important in the orchestra as Curly's wife progresses throughout the scene. Here is that moment in the orchestra. And as the scene progresses, those groups of notes over one beat become more and more important and more complex. Finally, mood setting, something that all great opera composers have to do. And Floyd does it beautifully at the beginning of Act 3. This is the point at which Curly and Lenny have their final meeting. It's in the interior of a barn, and Floyd writes in the libretto the kind of atmosphere, the kind of mood that he's trying to create. I want you to listen to what he writes. The late afternoon sun comes in through cracks in the walls, streaking the mounds of hay. From outside is heard the clang of horseshoes striking a metal peg and the sound of men's voices. Inside the barn there should be the feeling of quiet and lazy warmth. I think that's exactly what he gets in this prelude to Act 3. It's in a barn just like this that Lenny and Curly's wife have their final confrontation. The woman unaware of Lenny's mental incapacity, Lenny unaware as usual of his own strength. She offers him her long blonde hair to stroke and pet, and he does so, but of course too firmly. She becomes uncomfortable. He holds even more strongly. She tries to break away from him, and in screaming, Lenny tries to stifle the scream, and in doing so, strangles her. Lenny cries out in remorse, not so much that he's killed someone, but scared to death that George will find out. He's done something bad this time. He's afraid that George may leave him, and as far as Lenny's concerned, that's the real tragedy. Carlisle Floyd's libretto sticks very close to the original John Steinbeck story, with just a couple of minor exceptions. One of them is the fact that Steinbeck set the story in the late 1920s, whereas Floyd updates it to the 30s in order to take advantage of the connection between Steinbeck and the Depression in the cultural mindset of most audiences. This is also pretty terrific for scenic designers and directors who can take advantage then of Depression-era imagery. The wife's role, Curly's wife's role, is also expanded somewhat, both in the play and in the opera. And a minor character, whose name is Crooks, is dropped from the story. But other than that, most of the plot events are exactly as they occur in the original Steinbeck. The thing that I love about this piece, though, is that it's in a tradition of great American operas on American sources. Here's a wonderful example, Porgy and Bess by George Gershwin. It takes place in Charleston, South Carolina, just on the outskirts of that great city, the story of a black community dealing with their everyday problems. Douglas Moore's wonderful opera, The Ballad of Baby Doe, which is about Horace Tabor, the mayor of Leadville, Colorado at the turn of the century, and his love affair with a young baby doe, the wife of a coal miner. Robert Ward's operatic treatment of Arthur Miller's play, The Crucible, is also a wonderful American opera. It's a commentary on the McCarthy period by way of the Salem witch trials. And of course, I hasten to add Myron Fink's The Conquistador, which was premiered right here in San Diego, the story of the Spanish Jews coming across the Atlantic into Mexico and having to deal with the Inquisition in the New World as much as they had to deal with it in the Old. This is a wonderful operatic tradition. I think that's what we really learn about dealing with an American piece, that there are terrific American operas. Meanwhile, there are people looking for the great American opera. I suspect that the great American opera is already here. In terms of melodic development, this piece is filled with beautiful tunes. Sure, Carlisle Floyd uses dissonance, and as a matter of fact, one of the most interesting devices he uses is a constant change of rhythm and meter, particularly at the beginning of the opera, as if to signify the off-kilter relationship between George, Lenny, and the ranch hands. It keeps us off-kilter as well as an audience. But I really want to point out some of the more beautiful moments melodically from this score. Here to help me are two members of the present San Diego Opera Ensemble, baritone Chris Thompson and tenor Lars Melander. At first, I'd like to ask Lars to sing an excerpt from the end of Act 1. An itinerant ballad singer comes by the ranch hand's bunkhouse and sings a little tune. It's rather folk-like, and it symbolizes the life of a bindlestiff, the itinerant worker. The text is this: "Moving on, always moving on. Got no home, address unknown. Like a dry brown leaf in a winter wind, I am always moving on."
God's no home, address
There's a kind of outdoor American flavor to this tune, rather like the Scotch-Irish folk songs that the Okies brought with them from the Dust Bowl in the early 30s. There's also a moment for the baritone who plays the character of George. And George at this point is extremely upset with Lenny, in which he's telling Lenny that it's essentially his fault that they're in such trouble and they're running off to a new ranch trying to find work. And he expresses how frustrated he is about the fact that he's got Lenny to protect, Lenny to be with constantly. How simple life would be if he could just strike out on his own, live by himself, and get that home and property that he's always dreamed of.
My life would be so simple by myself. I could live so easy all alone. No mess, no fuss, no trouble, none at all. Just me to take care of. I, me, and mine.
You probably noticed the rolling, asymmetrical, rhythmic pulse of that piece. I think that signifies George's own psyche. He's being pulled this way and that. On the one hand, he wants to be loyal to Lenny. On the other hand, he would love to strike out on his own and be independent. Well, probably the most glorious moment in the score, certainly the most beautiful moment in Act 1, is the duet between George and Lenny. Lenny begs George to begin their nightly ritual. You see, every night on the road, George has to tell Lenny what his dream is. The dream of finally making enough money to buy a house, a couple of acres of land, some livestock, some land to work, to themselves become farmers, ranchers. The tune that accompanies this duet is so beautiful. It's like soothing and nurturing to Lenny. In the same way, it's soothing and nurturing to the audience. Listen.
Small shingled house on 2 acres of land, with its 2 acres of air and 2 acres of sky, will all belong to us. It will be home. It will be our home, and we'll live off the fat of the land, and we'll live off the fat of the land.
George and Lenny's dreams remain unfulfilled. After the death of Curly's wife, Curly and the ranch hands strike out into the fields looking for Lenny, seeking revenge. George realizes that in order to protect Lenny not only from the ranch hands but from himself, he's going to have to take matters into his own hands. He finds Lenny at the pond where the story begins, and he starts their nightly ritual, relating to Lenny their dream of home and property. Lenny looks out into the horizon and sees the cottage, the 2 acres, the livestock, the produce. And at the climax of the dream, George takes out a gun and shoots Lenny in the back of the head. Thus the story and the opera come to a sad conclusion. In keeping with my earlier comments about great American operas and that wonderful operatic tradition of American operas based on American sources, we have some recordings today that I'd like to talk about. First of all, a terrific recording of an opera by Carlisle Floyd, Susanna. There are no recordings of Mice and Men, but this is a wonderful substitute. It stars Cheryl Studer, Samuel Ramey, and Jerry Hadley. Terrific cast singing some beautiful, beautiful music. There's also an opera that I'd like to point out to you that you may not be aware of, Regina by Mark Blitzstein. This is based on the Lillian Hellman play, The Little Foxes. A wonderful story if you remember the Bette Davis movie. It stars Catherine Szynski, who was Herodias in our production of Salome. There is, of course, the perennial favorite, Porgy and Bess by George Gershwin. Probably the best recording of that is certainly this recording out of England, conducted by Simon Rattle. It's a terrific recording, just as if you're at the theater itself. Leonard Bernstein wrote an opera called A Quiet Place. It's not a very quiet opera, and rather about a dysfunctional family with lots and lots of problems. It's a difficult piece, but I think well worth recording and listening to, getting to know. Finally, Samuel Barber, that wonderful neo-romantic American composer, wrote a terrific opera by the name of Vanessa. The cast in this classic recording is Eleanor Stieber, Rosalind Elias, Regina Resnick, and Nikolai Geda. You can't get better singers to sing American music. Of Mice and Men is one of those unusual operas that, if you let it, will get under your skin and stay there. In fact, it's not just an opera. It's a theater piece, a music drama about real people and real emotions in an almost impossible human situation. It has lyricism, poignancy, and drama, all the elements of a great opera. I hope you're looking forward to seeing this piece in the theater as much as I am. Join me next time for Opera Talk. I'm Nick Reveles, and I'll see you at the opera.